Hi. One question we get asked a lot is how do we define disability? Oh, we've been interrupted by my puppy. This is Chester. He's going to be my new service dog once he's all trained. All right, let's try that again.
Summer Web Series. Summer Web Series. Summer Web Series.
One question that we get asked a lot is how we define disability. And it makes sense that this is a popular question because there are so many different ways of thinking about, talking about, acting or reacting to or acting around disability that go around in our society right now and also in history, and we get those stories passed down. So we thought in this episode we would go through a bunch of different models of understanding disability and talk you through some of them and give some examples, and hopefully that will be helpful in figuring out. It's sort of a bigger answer to the question, how do we define disability? So here we go. One model you might be familiar with is the charity model. Now, the charity model frames disabled folks as people that able-bodied people need to take care of and feel sorry for. Okay, so an example of this could be somebody who decides to run in a race to fundraise for, like, quote-unquote, the cure of autism. Because they think autism is something horrible that needs to be cured, and everyone who's autistic should be pitied horribly. Better yet, actually, an example would be somebody who works in the organization that planned this event. Okay, the charity model is an incredibly damaging way to understand disability. It infantilizes disabled people. It frames their lives as sad and deserving of pity. It's not only disrespectful, but it also erases the millions of disabled people who are living vibrant lives. Within the charity model, the leaders of these organizations and movements are almost always able-bodied. This fosters a relationship of patronization between non-disabled folks and disabled people, despite the fact that disabled people know best what they need for their bodies and lives.
So another model that you might be familiar with is the medical model. The medical model kind of places disability within a medical context. And so it always compares disabled bodies and folks to able-bodied folks. And it also usually sees disability as something that in the end needs to be cured. So an example of this might be a doctor who is really excited to treat a patient's case of rare muscular dystrophy. And so this doctor is excited to study this body and to see how exactly muscular dystrophy is working at this moment. And also the doctor's trying to find a cure so that no one will ever have to suffer this case again. Although there's nothing wrong with wanting to cure a disease, the medical model actually has a pretty dark history of experimenting on and dehumanizing disabled people. And this history is actually fairly similar to the history of a lot of Black and brown folks and their relationships with doctors, again, experimenting on and seeing their bodies as a scientific testing ground. And so in the medical model, almost always it's assumed that the doctor knows more about the patient than the patient does about their own body, which when inspected is a little bit silly. People have been living in their bodies for years and years. This happens a lot with doctors assuming that they know more about their patients' bodies than the patients themselves, instead of it being a real conversation about what patients need to be feeling healthy.
A model that many folks in the US would probably not be familiar with is the social model of disability. And this is a theory that was coined by Mike Oliver in the 70s. And it's based on his theorizing and all the activism that was occurring throughout the UK at this time. Mike Oliver is in England. In this model, he states that a disabled person is not disabled by their impairment, but rather that they are disabled by the society that creates these quote-unquote disabling barriers. So an example of this idea would be that a person who is in a wheelchair who cannot get into a building that has stairs is not disabled in that moment by their impairment, which would be their inability to walk, but they're disabled by the society that puts stairs and does not have a ramp. This is a really radical shift in the way that people understood disability, and it should be noted that Mike Oliver was a disabled man, and that this model shifted the dialogue about disability from an issue of an individual, a medical issue of an individual, to a societal issue of ableism and of lack of access.
So one more model that you might be familiar with is the disability rights model. The disability rights model focuses on ensuring human rights such as access to space, education, and employment to ensure that disabled folks can live a fulfilling life. This movement has predominantly taken place in the States and has seen victories such as the Urban Mass Transportation Act, an act that required all new American mass transit vehicles to have wheelchair lifts. The beginning of the independent living movement, a movement that focused on the right for disabled people to be able to live independently, and the introduction of the Americans with Disabilities Act, otherwise known as the ADA. And it's a law that focuses on protecting disabled American citizens. So as illustrated by these examples, disability rights activists usually work within the law. So, for example, if an employer refuses to employ someone because they are disabled, a disability rights activist might take this to the court of law, stating that it is this person's right to work. Or if a school kicks out a student because their diagnosed mental health is seen as too much of a liability to the school, this might be seen as a discrimination suit. We are looking at you, higher education institutions. However, the disability rights movement usually looks at medical proof as a way of proving disability. And this makes sense. When you're going up against a court of law, usually you need some sort of legal proof, and that usually comes from medical doctors. So therefore, disability is usually justified through the medicalization of disabled folks, which is where we kind of see disability justice taking this a step further.
Lastly, we have disability justice. Now, we're going to do a whole episode about disability justice, but I'm just going to give a brief outline here. Okay, so this is a framework that was coined by queer of color disabled activists in 2005 who were discussing a second wave of disability rights. And these were folks who were mostly politicized in other movements besides disability rights movement, but felt sort of pushed to the margins in those areas because of their disability and ableism within the movements they were politicized in. Meanwhile, not feeling at home in the disability rights movement because of racism, because of a single issue politic, because of a emphasis on assimilation. So many different reasons why people were not feeling at home, either in the disability rights movement or their home movement that they were politicized in, and came together to create disability justice. Disability justice discusses disability in relation to capitalism, classism, racism, queerphobia, along with many other forms of oppression. So many of the founders of the disability justice movement went on to form this performance project called Sins Invalid. And so at the library, we look to them a lot for resources about disability justice. I'm going to read to you the definition of disability from Sins Invalid. It says, "We define disability broadly to include people with physical impairments, people who belong to a sensory minority, people with emotional disabilities, people with cognitive challenges, and those with chronic and severe illness. We understand the experience of disability to occur within any and all walks of life, with deeply felt connections to all communities impacted by the medicalization of their bodies, including trans, gender variant, and intersex persons, and others whose bodies do not conform to our culture's notions of normal or functional."
So we at the Healing Justice Lending Library most strongly align with the disability justice understanding of disability. So we understand disability to include a variety of things such as mental health, chronic pain, and neurodiversity. We also understand the complicated and violent histories that different communities have had with doctors and do not require medical proof to use the library. Instead, we honor the fact that people know their bodies more intimately than any doctor can, and we just desire to provide the tools that people need to lead lives that are fulfilling to them. We also understand that there are many different reasons that someone may or may not identify as disabled, despite the fact that they may fall under these categories. So those who have developed asthma because of environmental racism, or some of our own elders who have developed chronic back pain from working on their feet in a wealthy home for a large part of their lives. Or even folks who have experienced a passing down of familial trauma and even experienced their own. We see these individuals as fundamental stakeholders of disability justice as well, and really want to include them in the movement and in our library. And so although we're politically rooted in disability justice, we also know that we couldn't exist without the pretty incredible work of disabled activists who came before us, particularly those who were active in the disability rights movement and the social model. So people like Mike Oliver, the Rolling Quads, Ed Roberts, these people all made the world a little more accessible and fundamentally shifting public understandings of disability.
The Healing Justice Lending Library hopes to continue the work of our disabled elders and push past medical definitions of disability onto something that encompasses the many ways that our bodies and minds operate in this world. We reject the idea that disabled people are deserving of pity, or worse, that disabled bodies are meant for medical examination and ultimately cure. Instead, the Healing Justice Lending Library celebrates bodies. We celebrate healing and life and community among disabled folks and people who desire some form of healing.